All right, welcome to part 2 of manipulating MS Forms responses in Power Automate. So hopefully you watched the previous video where I covered kind of the basics, the fundamentals of this in terms of the reasoning behind what we're talking about, which is taking part of the response from a choice question in a Microsoft Forms form and using that to populate a choice or a lookup column in a SharePoint list in Power Automate. So watch that video if you haven't already. This time we're focusing just on the multi-select lookup columns because that turned out to be the most complicated part of this. So I figured making a separate video will help me focus in on it a little bit and explain it a little bit better. So essentially what it comes down to is there are two ways to go about doing this. Well, first off, let's just talk about lookup columns, multi-select lookup columns in particular. In SharePoint, these are stored as an array of objects containing the item ID and the value. So just to explain what a SharePoint lookup column is, if you don't already know, it's a column that that shows up as a choice column but actually gets its values, its selections from another list or library in the site. And the data when you make those selections is stored as an object. If it's a single select column, it's an object of the ID number of the item that's selected and whatever value you're bringing over. Typically it's the title column, but it doesn't have to be. It could be a different column from the list. When you have a multi-select lookup column, then it's storing an array of objects of that form. So basically the array is ID number value for each of the selected choices. Now when you want to set this, setting a lookup column in Power Automate, especially a multi-select lookup column, requires building an array of the ID numbers. Now the ID numbers are not something that you would typically know. I mean, they're not shown, but they're not really concealed. Microsoft makes it possible to simply add that ID number column to your list, but it would confuse people even more if you were to put those ID numbers into your form somewhere. I mean, technically you could, but we want to try to avoid doing that. So essentially what we need to do is from the form response data, I've already talked about how anytime you have a multi-select question in a Microsoft form, it comes in as an array. So we first need to kind of clean that up, make it a proper JSON array. And then we need to somehow find the ID number that matches each of the values selected in the form response. And then we need to put that into the correct format to populate the SharePoint column. So a lot to unpack here. So basically what it comes down to is there are two ways to go about doing this, two options. The first option we're calling option 1 because it's the first, is to basically do the same thing we did for a single select lookup value, but repeat that process for each value in the array. So if they select 3 items from, 3 of the choices from that multi-select choice question in the form, it's going to repeat the process of looking up the, doing a get items in the SharePoint connector to retrieve the items that match that particular value and then return the ID number and then add that ID number to an array variable. What that means is that for every choice that's selected, the flow has to call the SharePoint API. Now, in the grand scheme of things, if your form, let's say you only have 2 of these multi-select lookup columns in your list that you're populating, and most people, let's say people are going to select at most 2 or 3 choices from the list, that means anywhere from 4 to 6 API calls, which is not a big number. The API call limit to SharePoint is something like 300 calls per minute, I believe. So it's not as if you're going to overload it with API calls. It's not really going to be a problem. But if you factor in how many people are going to be responding to your form at a given time, so if you might get 50, 60, 70, 100 responses in a short span of time, then yes, you could be looking at potentially hitting that API call limit and your flow getting slowed down. So it's just not terribly efficient. But let me just show you what this method would look like. Although in the previous video I did show the basically the method for a single select, which is, here's our vertical single select. So essentially we composed the answer, we got the value, we got the verticals matching that, and then we composed the ID of that individual. Now this is for a single select. For a multi-select, there's probably a way to do this without a variable, but I found it to be a little bit easier to understand and to build with a variable. So I just initialize this variable. So var verticals option 1, and then inside this option 1 scope, we can see how the process works. So the first 3 steps are largely the same. We're basically getting just composing the response using JSON. Well, this is a little different from the single select vertical because we need to use the JSON expression on that response data to make it a good, clean JSON array. And then using that output, we need to select the verticals or select the title. So in this case, it's the title column that we're using as the lookup target. So I need to select from that JSON array all of the titles and put them into this format that'll be a proper array of objects with a key of title and a value of the first part of that item. Then I need to use an apply to each loop, and I was really trying to find a way to avoid using the apply to each loop, but there really isn't any that I can come up with. If someone else knows a way to do it without an apply to each, please throw that in the comments and I will be thrilled that someone found a better way to do it. But I couldn't, and I spent a good amount of time on it. So anyway, this apply to each is basically taking as an input that array from these select verticals with title. So it's going to be an array of title blah, etc. Then for each one of those, it's going to use this get items action, and it's going to look for the item where the title of the item is equal to the title from that array of objects. And then I'm going to append to that var verticals option 1 array variable this format here to give me the ID number of the item. So we can't use the value of the item to set it like we could with a multi-select choice column. We need to use the ID number, and that's really where the complication comes in. So basically, if someone selects one of the choices, then this apply to each loop is only going to happen once. It's only going to run through once, and it's not a big deal. But if you have 6 choices and they select all 6, then this apply to each is going to happen 6 times, which means 6 calls to the SharePoint API. And that's when you have to start thinking about the scale of it. And again, so that's option 1. And option 1 does work. Absolutely it works. And we'll discuss in a few minutes that this is probably the better way to go if you're not overly concerned with a large volume of people completing the form in a short amount of time. Now, taking a look at option 2, option 2 is more complicated to build. Honestly, it took me a couple hours just to wrap my head around this, and I will try to reference a couple of posts on the Power Automate community that helped me find the solution. But essentially what we need to do is get a full list of those lookup values. So in this case, we're going to go to our verticals list and just download the whole list into the flow. So we're going to use one API call to SharePoint to get that full list of those values. In this case, it's only 6. If your list is larger than that, then it's going to be a larger array of values, but chances, kind of your best bet when using lookup columns is to use lists that have a short number of items, so 10, 15, 20 at the most, because you don't want someone to have, you know, a lookup column that is 200 items. It's probably not going to be a good user experience. Anyway, what we're going to do is get the full list of those lookup, and what we're going to do is then select from that the values or the title field and the ID to build an array. Then we're going to filter that to values that match the ones from the response array. So we have the array of titles and IDs from the list, from that lookup list. We have the array of titles that were selected. We're going to mash those together, return only those that occur in both. Now, in theory, you could do, there's an expression called an intersection, which if the two arrays matched, if they had the same format, you could use intersection. Because they don't, because one has title and ID and the other just has title, you can't use that. So we need to, again, use an apply to each loop. So let's just take a look at how that looks in Power Automate. So again, we have for verticals option 2, just establishing an array variable. And then in here, and this is where it gets a little bit ugly. So we're starting out the same. We're getting the answer. We're using JSON. We're selecting the titles. Now we're using a get items action to get all of those items. So in other words, in here, we're not filtering the query at all. By the way, if you leave this entirely blank, so if I left this blank, the flow checker would tell me that basically it would warn me that, yeah, get all verticals, and it says basically it's inefficient. You should have an OData filter query. If you want to avoid that, you can just put in the limit entries to a folder, put a /, and it will eliminate that warning. Just a little trick I learned. Anyway, so we're going to get that full list, and that's going to, you know, then we're going to use a select action to shape that, because that's returning a whole bunch of data. But really all I want is the titles and the IDs. So from those output values, I'm getting the title and the ID, and that's going to output the appropriate array of just those two values, or those two keys and values in the object. Then I need, and this is where it gets even more crazy. In this apply to each, we're basically running this apply to each loop is going to run for every item that's in the response array. So that's, oh, actually I made a little error here, so let me fix that. I need the select verticals option 2. There we go. So that's the array. It needs to, so it's going to be working on the output of that select action where we are building the verticals with the title. So for every one of those, filter the array of all of the titles, basically the output of that get items that's getting the whole list. So filter that to those items where the title is equal to the title in the array of selected options or selected items. So just to kind of explain the formatting here, this is where you do need to, again, play around a little bit with the item expression. So basically, let me go back in there just so I can kind of show you how that's put together. So in this filter array, on the left-hand side here, we're taking the items of the apply to each, and we need to get just the title. And that's a little more complicated. Like, you can't just use the dynamic content, you need to use an expression. So what I'm going to do is hit space, sorry, go to expression, hit space, go back to dynamic content, and then look for current item, which is going to be the item in that apply to each. So we select that, and that gives us that items apply to each option 2. And just to show you what I did there, because I realize I didn't do it very cleanly, I'm going to go back, click in here, go to expression, hit space, then go back to dynamic content, go all the way to the bottom and select current item, then go back to the top, and at the end of that we're going to put a question mark, square bracket, quote, title, single quote, that is. So basically that means from this array, or the item, the current item being processed in this loop, get the title. And then check, does that match the item? Now in this case, when we're using item and title, we mean the item from this output. So this piece here. So there you go. All right. Then basically this is going to output, if it matches, it's going to return an array. It's filtering the array, takes a larger number, an array of maybe 5 things, and if it finds any that match, then it's going to return those that match. So it's still going to be an array. So I'm using the length expression here to say if that length, the length of that, or the number of items returned from this filter, is not equal to 0. So if it finds a match, then apply or append to that array variable that first, the first item from that filter array output. Again, if I just said the output of the filter array, it would throw another loop in here, which we don't want. We know that it's only going to return 1, so we can use the first expression again. All right, so let's plug this. Let's actually go in now that we've kind of seen how all this works, and then the last thing is to just kind of output that variable. So let's go and run our flow, or fill out our form so it'll run the flow. So this flow is now turned on. Going back to my choices form, and I'll just select. And just to kind of demonstrate the difference in performance, I'm going to do one where we just select one value for that multi-select vertical. Again, the first 3 we don't really care about for this. And I'm going to submit that. And let's go back to our flow. And we can see that it ran 1 second ago. It succeeded. And if I scroll down, there is in option 1, we see that apply to each took 1 second, probably less than a second. It just rounds it up to a second. And if I go to option 2, it still took 1 second. So at the end of the day, if it's a single selection, it doesn't make a difference. But let's do that again. Let me submit another response. And this time I'm going to select all 6 of them and submit. And if we go and look at this is kind of giving you worst case scenario, and refresh. Now we can see that the total runtime for the flow went from 3 seconds to 7 seconds. Again, not a huge difference. But if we look at the option 1, it took 3 seconds to run. Option 2 took also 3 seconds. Kind of a wash. In fact, it's really hard to argue that you're better off using the more complicated method, unless you're concerned with that basically hitting that API call limit. If you don't have a lot of flows running, then clearly option 1 is probably going to be it's a simpler thing to build and probably going to work just as well. Now when we actually create that item, just to show that it does actually work, let me edit the flow here. and I'm going to run it again, putting basically in our vertical multi-select here, I'm going to plop in the option 1, hit save, and I'll just rerun the last flow. Test that by rerunning the last successful flow. And again, we can see it's going to take 3 seconds, and then it's pretty much going to finish. And if we go and look at our choices with descriptions list, there it is, and we can see that it's selected all 6 of those. So we're good to go. Just to show that the other method works as well, I'm just going to change that out for the option 2, save, and we will test that again, just using the last trigger, the last run. And we can see it completes, and we've got the same output. So either way will work. Just going back to our slides here. So basically the outcome is it depends. I was expecting there to be more of a difference in the processing time for, knowing that SharePoint API calls can be sometimes time consuming. But we're not retrieving so much data that it's actually pretty fast. So I don't think you're going to see any significant difference in performance at this scale. If you had 10 questions that were all doing this, then yes, you're kind of multiplying the time it's going to take by 10. But if you only have a couple, then that first option of just looking up, repeating that get items action over and over again is going to be just fine. But if you do have a lot of lookup columns, by the way, there is a limit. I think it's 12 lookup columns is the maximum number of lookup columns you can have in a SharePoint list. But the point is, if you have a lot of them, then you're basically multiplying the time it takes for your flow to run by the number of those lookup columns, those lookups that need to occur. So you're the one that knows your form and your flow and your data, so it's really your choice. But I would say unless you really need to optimize performance, option 1 is definitely a little easier to build because you don't have that filtering. The array step is complicated. It took me a number of tries to get it right, but there you go. That is basically how to set the multi-select lookup columns in SharePoint from Power Automate from a form multi-select choice question. So hopefully this was useful. Like I said, if someone does have a way to do this that does not require or does not rely on using an apply to each in a variable, please let me know, because I would love for there to be a more efficient way, a cleaner way to do it. But if not, you know that there is a way to do it. So hopefully this was useful to you. If you have any questions, throw those in the comments down below, and have a great day.